all those children of Fairfield Road School who were going to be evacuated in the event of war had been rehearsing evacuation exercise at their school, Fairfield Road, for around 1 year before the outbreak of war, and everywhere the peace seemed to be on the agenda. Rehearsals were discontinued, but at long last war seemed more likely, and on the previous days of that week, Monday to Thursday, we attended school carrying our gas masks to get used to having them. On the Friday, 1st of September 1939, we assembled down in the playground where the mothers were gathered with their worried faces, and we were marched off to Bow Road Underground Station, waving goodbye as we went, and parents standing there with tears streaming down their faces. This is what you call a goodbye. With cases and bags, gas masks and labels to prevent us getting lost, we wondered what was going to happen to us. I was 13 years old at the time, and my two sisters, Mary, 12 years old, and Joyce, who was only 5 at the time, were up at the front of the walking crocodile on the way to Paddington Station. Paddington seemed so large as we waited with our bundles and cases, already too much of a burden. I saw my sisters, Mary and Joyce, in the distance and waved, letting them know I was still there. We boarded the train, received a stick of barley sugar, and hurriedly seated in our compartments listened to the rush of steam from the giant engine and watched with fears and excitement as the ground passed by. Where were we going? No one knew. Later it was revealed only the headmaster, Mr. Ward, knew. It was late afternoon that we arrived, marshalled into the playground at the Henry Box School, Witney. We seemed to be there for a long while. We were given a very small tin of corned beef and small tin of cocoa. A number of double-decker buses were there, and we guessed they were for us. I saw my sisters and told them I would find out where they were, as it was plain that we were going on different buses. I arrived at Clanfield just about tea time. The smell was so strange to us. Seeing the cows and smelling the fruit, I should think it was around 40 of us boys, except for 1 or 2 very young sisters who arrived. We were taken into the Clanfield Institute and shared out to well-scrubbed ladies and herded round the village, calling at the houses as we went. I palled up with the Rutter family, 3 boys and 1 girl. A lady took us to different houses, but we were not housed. At last, a nice tidy lady stood at the gate, eyed us up and down, and protested I thought they were going to be girls. There aren't any, was the reply. She reluctantly took one of the brothers and me inside, hurriedly giving us a drink and asking what we had eaten since 9 o'clock that morning. Nothing, Dennis told her. She gave us some cake and started preparing an old tin bath with a bowl after bowl of hot water. We were scrubbed well and truly and given our change of underwear. She threw the dirty clothes in the corner and emptied the dirty water. It all had to be done with a large ladle. There was no running water. The toilet was at the end of the garden and smelt like nothing on earth. There was no electric light in the house, but a tiny fire in the eating room. What on earth is going to happen to us? Dennis asked. God only knows, I said, and off to bed we went. Saturday morning, Dennis cried as soon as he woke up. I want to go home, he waved. I threatened him and then managed to pacify him. Don't worry, I collect fag cards and I've got one picture of a new plane, the Spitfire. It's ever so fast. Dennis sat up in bed, threw his arms around in the air and screamed, I'm a Spitfire, I'm a Spitfire. Quiet in there, called a lady's voice, and we carried on with a whisper. We were in the country. The lady of the house was Mrs. Farmer. We asked, after our breakfast, where we could go down to the village. I'll go to their shop and then on to the Institute. Have a good look round, she said. Your other brothers, Dennis, are in Naps, she said to my mate. On the corner over there, pointing out the window. Off we went. We met them, Henry, Rosie and the eldest Billy, excitedly changing our early experiences, and all agreed that this place we had been dumped in was too far from London and too far for us to walk. Little Rosie, only 4 years old, began to cry, and all we could do was tell her she'd be okay, as we would look after her. We got to the shop and went inside and experienced the most strange smell, which later we learned was the fresh apples. The little round-faced lady was quite kind and gave us a very large helping of apples for 1 penny, that later we learned were called Bam fares. This didn't mean anything to us. Thanking the round-faced lady, we left the shop and walked the whole length of the village, stopping at intervals to watch the fish and frogs in the brook. And that we liked. We heard ladies talking outside their houses, and we learned that they were shocked. Over 30 boys and 2 little girls, one said. We hung round to hear further conversation, only to learn how dirty we were and what was the use of boys. Why didn't we get girls, one said. At least we could have cleaned them up and they could do some of the housework. They scoffed their food anyway. What a thing to hear on a frightening first day. And what did they expect after what we had been through? A rumour went round the village that we had to go to the Institute on Monday morning with gas masks at 9 o'clock. The local children glared at us weird lot and whispered and laughed, but they said hello, and that was it. We looked at the place where we would school for what we were told were 2 weeks only. Then we would be going home. But this wasn't so. The war lasted much longer than that. On the next morning, September the 2nd, we asked the foster mother where my sisters were. They told me Bampton, 2 miles away. You can walk there if you promise to be careful. The brothers, Dennis, Henry, and the eldest Billy, set off with myself, not knowing how far we had to go. By coincidence, we met my sisters Joyce and Mary at the wheel turn roughly halfway, as they had wondered how far Clanfield was. We spent around 15 minutes exchanging our strange stories, and at least we had cheered them up. We said goodbye, turned and tramped off to our new home for about a mile or so away. On the Sunday we made a return along Bampton Road, ate some unripe blackberries and strolled home. On reaching home, Mrs. Farmer was at the cottage gate and said, "Boys, the war has been declared at 11 o'clock. This was it. On the Monday, we assembled in the Carter Institute, which was now our school, stood in the floor space and were checked with our gas masks, breathing and walking up and down the floor. Of course, we were experts now. We had been practicing for a year or so and had gone through all the blackout training as well. The village kids were laughing at us there in our gas masks, but we knew what we had been taught correctly and proudly put our masks back in our carrying boxes and were dismissed by the head. "Chambers and Surrey, stay behind," said Mr. Ward. We looked at each other, Surrey and I, thinking, hello, what have we done? But all they wanted us to do was to help them make these blackout curtains, which were really wooden slats and a covering. But we had to drill and hammer, saw, nail, screw. But day after day, we unloaded a cart of wood, tools and other materials and slaved at this new occupation. "That's it, thanks boys," said the head when we'd finished. I had the job of cutting and fitting sticking brown paper across the windows as a shrapnel and blast protection. Of course, most of us would experience this back in London with bombing that would last until the end of the war. But that was the future. On the Saturday, we met a local kid whose father was foreman at the Wilmer's farm, end of the village. He told us of his rabbiting work, and seeing how friendly we were, went home to get his little dog. Called Spider it was. He took us across the fields and after giving us instructions on what to do, set about shoving the dog down a hole as we watched in amazement at the results of an hour or so producing 14 rabbits. He gave me 2 and others 2 as well, and of course to us it was quite a thing. We'd never really seen wild rabbits. Proudly carrying them home to Mrs. Farmer and told her the old story. "You can't do that," she said, "it's stealing." "They were running round all over the place," I said. "You mustn't do it again," she added, and said about skinning them and, needless to say, cook them for dinner. It was my first lesson in learning that in the country wrong is right when it suits you. The Rutters were kicked out of the Knapp's house the next day. No one ever knew the reason why, but it was assumed by most of us that they were too hoity-toity for these scallywags of East London. Later, the headmaster went there for a while. The strange thing was a year or so later, I was to sing at their father's funeral. And years later, After forming a youth club at the age of 19 in the rough and ready East End, I was to be supplied by sacks of vegetables at full market price when 22 of us camped at Radcott. I told the lads of the village, who were now adults, of this mean action and against a striving poor youth club, I ask you. The next morning a number of them arrived at Radcott and threw us vegetables fresh and plentiful. "There you are, Arthur," one said. "You know we're not all like that." They then challenged us to a game of cricket for the next day. We had some friends, you see. On starting school, our teacher, Mr. Haig, who was to be killed during the war later, told us that we were going to learn how to write a card and address it to our home to let them know where we were. He read out all the details, Clanfield, Oxfordshire, and we copied it, and the head told us that we had to gather on the following Sunday here outside at 10:30. This we did, and were marched off to the village church for a morning service. It was nothing foreign to me, as I'd been singing in the church choir at home from 6 years old, and sang in a school's choir at the Albert Hall in 1936. I also used to toll the bell for our morning service every Sunday. During my time in Clanfield, I went on many afternoons with Mr. Ward, who was something of a musician, while he got carried away playing church music and other things. I used to have to pump like mad and then run round to the organ, turn the page of music, and when he yelled out "turn," I had to run back again, carry on pumping and carried on pumping. He was very kind to me, teaching me drama and giving me all the main parts in the plays. Also I conducted at village concerts the singing of rounds. I wrote an enormous amount of poems and songs. Indeed, I was snarled at by Mr. Farmer. On one occasion I had gone to bed and heard them arguing. He was saying that all I did was study and write for hours on end through the night. But Mrs. Farmer put him right, crying, "Can you write poems? And can you write music? Can you act in plays? The trouble with you, Fred, is you're jealous. You've only lived in this off-the-track village all your life." I respected her very much after that. He used to tip his hat to people in the village, but only those that were going to give him work, and of course the so-called gentry. The working families of the village detested these people, but they never complained about anything. Who would think that now, 2004, 1939 villagers lived like that? We found it strange. After 1 month of getting to know the way people lived, some of the parents came to see their children, and after hearing stories of mistreatment and lack of affection, took them back home. What we know to be different was the fact that most of the villagers had never been anywhere or done anything, only of course lived a village life. Most of the men, for instance, only experienced the new life and personally noticed the difference after the war. Their Army, Navy and Air Force experiences educated them. The way of life was changed dramatically by the vackies and later the army. Some of the children that returned to the East End did not survive the war, but it was their wish to return. There was also the distaste we had for certain families. One in particular was the Bye family of Black Bolton Road. I hated them. Managed, with the advice of Mrs. Farmer, luckily, to get a frozen kingfisher from the cat, who had it in his mouth. But he was dead anyway. It must have been the weather, she said. Frozen. It was beautiful. And she said, why don't you see if Mr. Ward can get it stuffed for you? This was very exciting to me. Mr. Ward said, when I asked him, that a young member of the Bye family had agreed to preserve it. I told Mrs. Farmer, and Mr. Farmer then suggested he would give me some glass. And at woodwork in Bampton, I could ask Mr. Blake, our London woodwork teacher, if I could make this case under his care and instruction. And a few weeks later, I had the showcase finished. The bird was going to stand on a small wooden stump over a stream made of glass. I waited weeks for the kingfisher to be returned, and Mr. and Mrs. Farmer suggested I ask Mr. Ward about it. I brought the matter up on a few occasions, but it was not returned, and I angrily told Mr. Ward, I have everything ready for it, all made. All I need is the bird. I don't think we should press the matter now, he said. It would not help our relationship with the village. I was really angry. The village got to hear all about it, and they were quite annoyed at the outside robbery of a little boy, and they shook their head at the whole news. Many years later, I was drinking in the Mason's Arms, talking about this, and one chap said, he's got one, I know. Well, I said, gentry, don't make me laugh. I partly got my revenge for all this, as Mr. Ward picked myself and two of the Rutter boys to pick some apples for the vicar. He took us to him, and he gave us strict instructions on what tree he wanted us to work on. Take 2 each when you're finished from any other tree, but don't touch that one, only put them in the baskets. Put all the baskets in the shed when you're finished, not even a thank you, I ask you. We had a great idea. We tore holes in our coat pockets and stuffed apples galore around our coats, bulging like circus clowns. Of course, no one saw us return to our billets, as it was the end of the village. I wrote a song later on and added tonic scales. Mr. Ward kindly took it to the vicar and he wrote a composition to it. He came to the school and played it on the piano for me to sing to. What a mess it was. He thought I wanted a symphony. I ask you, judge for yourselves. This is the first verse. There are times when we are dull, when we are dull. There are times when we are bright, when we are bright. There are times when we are merry. Don't be afraid of Jerry. Thumbs up, boys. Have a good time. What do you think? Mrs. Farmer welcomed the apples that we'd got, but of course she hadn't seen the pockets. Most of the people had never seen or even knew of any Jews, and so the 8 that we had were treated by some annoyance and contempt. My sisters arrived one day at the school during holidays, and the head brought them in the classroom to watch while we rehearsed a play. What a treat for us all. Afterwards, the girls clapped enthusiastically. This pleased us a lot. Mr. Ward got the girls together and said, "Now be careful going back to Bampton, you girls, and thank you for coming." Off they went. Another 2 miles they had to walk. We all knew that this would soon have many problems. The LDV, Local Defence Volunteers, that later became the Home Guard, was formed, and I joined all the lads that were available to meet at the school to be formed into some form of unit. Of course they were all 16, 17, 18 years of age. Farmers and old age pensioners. That was all that was available. But the Captain Mannering of the unit said, "Not you, son, you're too young." "I'm 14, I said. And a lot of the villagers protested, as I was already a part of the village, and they wanted me there. "Very well then," Mr. Mannering agreed. "You can be a carrier and messenger." I was now a soldier. Well, well. Our woodwork walks to Bampton continued, and it shocked us to see that the fields had changed. The large ones had poles throughout the whole of the fields, something like 15 feet high. It was very eerie. And on reaching Bampton, our woodwork teacher told us that they would prevent enemy planes landing. Yes, this was a war, all right. Another experience of walks to Bampton comes to mind when early in our schooling Mr. Ward called us all together around his table and told us to take a good look at the rucksack laying on his desk. "This is your first aid bag when you go to Bampton for woodwork. Chambers here will carry it and is in charge of the equipment. These are the bandages. This is the tourniquet," undoing it and tying it round a boy's shoulder. "Like this," he said. "And this is mustard gas ointment." We knew now that we were going to be involved, very involved, in this war. "But put it over your shoulder, Chambers. That's it," he said as I obeyed. "Now, boys," he said, "if any planes fly low over you to attack, jump in the ditch and stay there. And stay there till it's safe. Do you hear?" he said. "Yes, sir," we replied. The strange thing about this war was that later in London, at lunchtime one day, a German bomber flew almost directly over me. I could see the pilot, as clear as day, heading for Westminster away. But the trooping of a dozen or so boys led by myself, having no idea except to jump in the ditch, is spooky. I had to move to the Forge Cottages later on September 1940 with the Frank Parrott family, and things changed there. I stayed up later at night, seated by the fire with the son Norman. I was happy there, allowing to be more grown up. The head, Mr. Ward, came to a decision where he had lost the 2 other teachers for the call-up in the services. He decided that he didn't have time to teach me anymore, and I'd gone through all the books. "We'll close the petition in the centre," he said, and I want you to look after 6 of the boys for dictation and other things. Yes, sir, I said. This we did, and as I had in my half of the room the more backward boys, it allowed him to work with the others. Very weird, wasn't it? The following week, he opened the divider again and told us all there are some children's mothers arrived from London due to the Blitz starting, and I'm closing school for the rest of the day, so that you can see if you have any parents to see. We all stood to attention. Good night, sir, we cried, and hurried out into the street, and to my amazement met my mother. They had had enough of the raids, and after losing a few friends, they had to get away from it all. My mother managed to get a room in a Broad Street house, and later, of course, both my sisters joined her. In Clanfield and Bampton, it was filling to the brim. At the weekend, I walked to Bampton and reunited with my mother and sisters on the Sunday. My other 2 sisters arrived in Bampton, and they and mother lived together in the one room. That's how things were then. I had a nice Christmas at the Parrots, as most of the vackies did in their billets. The bad stories of children had more or less faded away, as they should. There was a Christmas show at the school, and in it we did 2 plays. One was 2 blind men and a donkey. No, I didn't play the donkey. The other was The Old Bull, a farming drama. After this, we sang a few rounds, including London's Burning. Not very good choice, eh? The adults played the popular farce, Laughing Gas. All this was the cause of me becoming a professional singer and actor, with Novello, etc. Once in those days I played Swindon and managed to get back to Clanfield to see old friends. Mr. Ward, of course, played the Cockney gas vendor. The Christmas was pleasant when you consider the state of the war. There was still a terrible class difference, but the one who made them feel guilty was Lady Colville in Bampton, who organised many things for the vackies. One of the proofs of this is my good friend Ruth Wheeler, who has a number of photographs of a day spent on the lawn playing cricket and enjoying the day at the big house. What a lovely lady. I met my first girlfriend later. She and 2 others used to come to the church and evening service. She spoke to my sister, Joyce, only a while ago, telling her of the meets that we had back in those days. In the spring, I was walking to the village shop and saw Mr. Ward standing on the Brook Bridge talking to an elderly gentleman that I knew. "Chambers," he called, "come over here." I went over to them, and Mr. Ward said, "You don't know who this is, do you?" "Yes, I do, sir," I said. "It's Mr. Lansbury." "How did you know that?" he said. "Well, he presented me with 9 prizes over 3 years at Atley Road School in Bow," I answered. The grey-haired man held out his hand and shook mine. "Well done," he said. and bade goodbye. I think many times when I watch Murder, She Wrote on TV, I wonder what Angela, his granddaughter, would say about that. 70 miles from your home area in 1940 was a very long way. And Mr. Wall told me he was suffering from ill health. War had a great effect on him. So I estimated that they were old friends. It was a month or so later when my older sister arrived at Forge Cottages and asked Mrs. Parrott if she could get my clothes together, as she and Doris and my mother had rented a cottage in Bampton. I didn't have a lot, and so it wasn't long after saying goodbye that we walked the 2 miles to Bampton. I loved it with the Parrott family, and although it had not been a long stay, it was fun, and my going home to the family was the only compensation there was for leaving Frank and Mrs. Parrott and Norman, the son, was not very pleasant. I had had 2 families looking after me, and they were kind. I never experienced bad things as some had done. The number of boys now reached less than half. Still, it made it easier for Mr. Ward. The last time I saw him was a real surprise. I was going to work one morning to Woodford Green, east end of London, and we bumped into each other. He going to school in Bow, and I just yards down the road. We were on the same pavement as we met. He was so excited and hopped around. Then he cried, "Stay there a minute and I'll get Mrs. Ward." He rushed back home and brought back the little lady who had been so kind to me in Clanfield. We talked about many things, and I told of my training that I was having for the professional musicals, and he was so pleased that I was doing this. I know that it made theirs. This was 1947. The odds of meeting him like this, 4 miles apart in London, was terrific. I was hearing all the stories in Bampton that my sisters, Millie, the eldest, and Doris, told me they and Mum had got to know all the pubs and other evacuated parents also. They sang songs and laughed and joked. Some locals wondered what it was all about, but my mother told them one evening when they moaned about the noise, "You don't know what war is all about. You'll know if you go through what we've gone through. Anyway, EastEnders have always sung and danced. They had nothing else to live for." The nice thing about it was they soon started to look forward to it at night times with us. There at the cottage, my mother and sisters planned the near future for us all. We would all get jobs. They were easy to get in Witney, we decided, and that was the place. So on the Monday morning, we all walked to what was then Bampton Station, shortly after called Bryce Norton. The only drawback was the time of the train to Whitney, as there were only one or two, and so they didn't really generally fit in with workers' requirements. We called at the Labour Exchange, and I was offered a job at de Havilland's on the A40, a small drone, where my sister Doris was also going to work. She got a job spraying aircraft, an important job at the time. My job was a real bore. I did very little, and so bored, did one day there, and the next day I packed up and I was called to the offices to see Geoffrey de Havilland. You'll get more to do and a better job if you stay, he said. No, thank you, sir, I answered, and off I went to walk to Whitney Exchange. Remember, we all had to walk wherever we wanted to go in those days. Maybe a few bikes were used, but you saw very few cars on any road those days. Gradually, everybody had become used to scrimping and saving, and the girls, for instance, managed to get hold of 2 army blankets. And Mum, being in the tailoring game, made 2 jackets and skirts. These were great for them to go jitterbugging in, but they moaned that they were both grey. Dye them then, Mum shouted. Every girl at the dances would love them, so they shut up and dressed for the kill. But they had to walk to the gate of the field on the road, then down to the dance, and there were no lifts by cars to be had. Even those few cars that there were had very little ration for petrol. Things were getting really tough. The man I saw at the exchange gave me a card and directed me to the churchyard. Turn right. There, in front of you, he said, is the Whitney Blanket Company. They have been taken over by a London engineering firm on important war work. I thanked him and was inside the factory talking to a man who I later learned was the maintenance foreman, whose job it was to build stores taking in brand new machinery, lathes, capstans, mills, gear cutters, etc. There were only 3 men there. 2 of them were locals. I joined in with the team, and as the weeks rolled by, I saw the whole works change from a blanket mill to a high-precision arms factory. My 2 sisters came to the works in a few weeks, the younger one to work on a capstan lathe, and Millie in the temporary built office. I was all alone for 2 weeks, being taught on a lathe and making fine nuts and bolts. In 6 weeks, war workers were brought in from London as skilled staff, and also to train the labour that they were obtaining from the surrounding villages. On some occasions, as I had been used to visiting the smithy by the cinema near the Buttercross, I was sent to have articles quickly made, and they were number 1 urgency for the war effort. One day he turned quickly to a farmer who complained that I should have to wait my turn. "Don't be silly," he snarled. "He's top priority. If the integral are not seen to first, we won't have a country to farm. You're number 2 priority." He heated the metal, smashed at it on the anvil, gave me 4, and then said, "Tell them this is what they wanted, just to get them going, and there will be more later." "Thank you, sir," I said, and sped back on my way. These wedges that he had made would be under a machine in 1 hour, the wiring done, and then concreted and cleaned down ready for use the next day. We made hydraulic pumps for air screws on the well-known planes of the war, from Spitfire to Lancaster. We worked like mad, and were proud to do it. Because of the lack of transport, I had to walk from Bampton and also return from Witney, which was tiring. But that is what we did in those days. One morning with my mother, I was waiting for a train at the station, and one came thundering to a halt, and out jumped a train full of soldiers, ordered to stand easy and obviously to wait for transport. A big pleasant looking squaddy looked over at us and then came to us and said to my mother, "Hello, missus. Do you know what the place Bampton is like?" "All right," my mother said. "There's over 10 pubs and lots of evacuees from London. There's a few stuck-up locals, but no one cares about them. There's a war on. We drink in the Horseshoe mostly. There's a piano and sing-song. See you in there, perhaps?" "Yes," he said. "We'll try that." He needed to get to know my mother, as she was going to be his mother-in-law. He came with us to Bampton a few years ago, and we had a pint in the Horseshoe, stories of the war being told by us all. He and a few others were billeted in the yard at the Horseshoe, up the stairs to what was called the loft. Things were getting easier with the army around, and they were from Norfolk generally. George, my brother-in-law, being a cook in his company, used to bring a pound of sugar up to the cottage to get him Mum's good books, and he became a great help to the meagre ration that we had at that time. Mum and my 2 sisters went to every dance and sing-song, annoying some of the local girls with their popularity with the boys in uniform. One important factor about the war was living for the day. Tomorrow you never knew what would happen to you. One of the days, going to work, I went with Georgie Knight, the son of Sarah Knight, who lived in Bampton for a few years. Needing to go to Witney, we decided for comfort to go to the station now called Bryce Norton, instead of walking. And as we tramped out of the village towards Bryce Norton, A lorry came along the road from Bampton, and the driver said, "Where are you going? Can I help you, lads?" "We want to go to Bryce Norton," Jules said. "Jump in," he said, and in we climbed, thanking him for saving us from the walk to the station. Before we knew what was going on, he went over the railway bridge and turned into the drome through the guarded gate just over the bridge. We were stopped by the guards at the gate. The driver showed them his pass, and they waved us all on, through to the hangars. We were so scared of what might happen to us, as this was at the height of the war. No one should have got in. "Where do you want to go?" the driver said. "This'll do fine," Jules said. And absolutely dumbfounded, we thanked him and jumped down onto the hangar road. The lorry sped off, and I turned to Jules and said, "Well, George, what do we do next?" "Come on," he said. He was 2 years older than me, and I followed him, hoping this would all go away. "See them blokes in overalls over there, going into that hangar?" he said. "Where the Bolton Paul Defiant is standing near the Spitfire?" I asked. "That's right. Come on, we'll mix in with them." He didn't seem to care a damn about the danger we were in. We weren't even in overalls, but we craftily mixed in and were surprised to get inside the hangar, have a cheese roll with a cup of tea, and keeping out of the way of trouble. As soon as we could, we managed to go across the drome and got to a cabbage field. "Come on," said George, "we'll go across here, towards the top road at Whitney." Through the wire we went. "Halt! Who goes there?" shouted a soldier holding a rifle and looking if he was ready to blow our heads off. He advanced towards us, and Jules spoke up as to what had happened. The guard, realising how stupid it all was, shouted, holding the rifle at the ready, "Get across that bloody field and out to the road." "Yes, sir," I said, and we tore across the field, coming out into a small road, finding our way along lanes until we got to the A40. It took ages, and eventually, when we got to Whitney, George and I parted. Me to the war factory, whereas I was so late, something like 10:30 it was. The office manager looked at me across his desk and said, "I've heard some stories in my time. Now get out and get on your lathe chambers." Whew, blimey, that was some day. This made it obvious that I needed transport to Whitney, and my sisters took the opportunity to put pressure on the manager to try and get a workers' bus to go round the villages, picking up mainly locals as they went. We tried all sorts of things to get the transport, but to no avail. And eventually my sister Doris decided to return to London, and I was advised to do the same. After a week or so, I got to work and told the manager I was going back to London. So he had lost 2 competent operators. The foreman on the lathe line moaned that I, on top of my sister going, was too much for him to handle. Sorry, Lofty, I said, but I've made up my mind. I've been in this job now for quite a while. I was the first machine operator, and I worked all the overtime, walking mostly 14 miles per day. I think London will reward me more, and I've had enough. I returned to a quieter London, but of course, that was only a rest period. I returned to Bampton and Clanfield in 1943 and called on my young sister, who was now in Clanfield, staying with the daughter of Mrs. Gillett at the post office. I walked to Bryce Norton Station, and there on the bridge, watching the sky full of gliders training for the attack on the Jerrys to come. We in London were still going to get night and day of bombing by the V1s and the V2s. But that is another story. There was an occasion at Clanfield when Mr. Ward acquired a sheet of thick leather, sharp knife and other tools to instruct us on shoe repairing. He chose me after Mr. Blake at Woodwork had given me some lengthy coaching. Mr. Ward got hold of a strong tree stump, took us out onto the village green, seated me, and put the hobbing foot on the stump and said, "This is the best place to do the work." One of the Rutter boys had a very bad shoe, and Mr. Wall took it off when we got back to the classroom and said, "I'll show you what you can do when you start on it tomorrow morning." I repaired a few pairs of shoes when it was necessary in the coming year. The second story occurred over the fields near the plantation cottages, when George Knight and I went rabbiting. We collected some dead wood, and after no success with the rabbits, we rested on our way back from the fields at the trout stream and heard someone screaming at us. It was a large round farmer. "Get off this land," he yelled, and fired a gun over our heads. The next day the police arrived and searched the outhouse, taking a few pieces of wood with them. George had already told his father of the scare that we had, and he volunteered to take George's place and owned up to the authority. At the magistrate's hearing, the farmer was chastised for using a gun, and the magistrate told the hearing that the pieces of wood were not stakes, as there was no barbed wire markings on them and no hole in the wood, so therefore it couldn't possibly be a boundary stake, as the farmer had said. So all Bill was doing, he claimed, was looking at the trout in the running stream. Bill came home and at that evening went out and got drunk. The magistrate had obviously seen the horrid attitude of this man that everybody detested. You see, it wasn't the vackies this time, was it? Sometimes they were used just to take blame for something that they didn't do.